Aileen Wuornos is the most famous female serial killer, but was she really guilty or not? If anyone else had lived in those conditions, would they have become a serial killer? Aileen was an American woman who endured a horrific childhood of abuse and rejection by her family, but in adulthood she decided to take harsh revenge on men. This led her to commit a series of terrifying murders, and her name was registered as the most famous female serial killer in American and even world history. Due to her difficult life, Aileen was forced into prostitution from childhood. They even say she started down this path at the age of 11 when she was still in elementary school. But how did Aileen's life get to this point? What was her childhood like that it led to such a bitter fate? Aileen's father was a rapist with a criminal record who even raped his own daughter when she was a child. When Aileen turned 13, her father, who had been imprisoned, hanged himself in jail. But this brought no relief for Aileen, because she also had a brother who was raping her as well. Her mother was an Irish immigrant who, upon her husband's death, took her son and left, abandoning her daughter. Aileen's custody was given to her paternal grandparents. But even in these circumstances, Aileen's life was not good. Less than a year later, Aileen's grandmother died of liver failure, and during that time, when Aileen was 14, she said her grandfather also subjected her to abuse, beatings, and sexual assaults. But what happened to her at the age of 15? When Aileen was 15, her grandfather's friend raped her, and she became pregnant. During that time, she dropped out of school and went to a home for unwed mothers to give birth to her child. After the birth, fights between Aileen and her grandfather escalated, and she was eventually forced to live for a time in the woods surrounding the city. Aileen gave her child to a child care center, but to survive, she herself resorted to prostitution and petty theft. This is how she got by, and it seemed as if a bright path was never ahead of her. When Aileen turned 20, she decided to flee her city and go to Florida. She found a 9-year-old man named Lewis Fell and married him. Lewis was a successful, nearly retired man who was the president of a yacht club. In this way, Aileen escaped the horrible life she had. But this freedom did not last long. Aileen soon started leaving the house and going to a local bar, which always led to fights with others. Her behavior towards Lewis was also not very appropriate, and she abused him in a way. Aileen later confessed that she had even beaten Lewis Fell with his own cane. After a while, Lewis Fell was finally able to get a court order and asked Aileen to stay away from him. In the end, after only 9 weeks of marriage, Aileen was forced to separate from him. At the same time, another piece of bad news arrived for her. Her brother, who had abused her during childhood, died of cancer. Aileen received $10,000 from her brother's life insurance and spent part of this money on fines for driving under the influence. With the rest of the money, she bought an expensive car, but while under the influence, she had a terrible accident with that same car, and it was completely destroyed. When her money ran out, Aileen returned to Florida again, and this time she was arrested for several crimes, such as robbery. In one of the robberies, she had only stolen a pack of cigarettes and $35. This is a really small amount for an armed robbery. During this period, Aileen returned to prostitution again. In 1986, one of her clients claimed that Aileen had pulled a gun on him and demanded money. The police had no choice but to arrest Aileen. A year after this incident, Aileen met a hotel maid named Tyria Moore, and they started living together. This woman, who would later be involved in Aileen's crimes, played a very important role in her life. In fact, for a very long time, Tyria was a very valuable person to Aileen. Now we get to the part about Aileen Wuornos' murders and crimes. Aileen always told conflicting stories about the murders. Sometimes she claimed she was a victim of rape and said she committed all the murders in self-defense to prevent being raped. But other times, she said her motive for these murders was robbery. In general, whenever someone spoke with her, her story of the murders changed. As far as we know, Aileen's first victim was a man named Richard Mallory, who was 51 years old and had a history of rape. Mallory owned an electronics shop when he met Aileen in 1989. After shooting Mallory several times, Aileen left his body in the woods and stole his car. Well, now that we're talking about Aileen's first murder, there's an interesting point I've read before that I want to share with you. Sometimes it's said that Aileen chose her victims in a certain way. The story I heard is that Aileen would pick a man, spend a whole day with him, and if that man started to harass her or intended to rape her, Aileen would kill him. Now, I don't know where I heard this, and I have to say that I haven't found a credible source for it. As far as I remember, this story was told by Aileen herself. In May 1990, Aileen committed her second murder, and this time her victim was a 43-year-old man named David Spears. Wuornos shot David 6 times and after the murder stripped the clothes from the victim's body. Exactly 5 days after David's body was found, the corpse of another 40-year-old man named Charles Carskaddon was discovered. He had been shot 9 times, and his body was left by the side of the road. On the 30th of June, 1990, a 65-year-old man named Peter Seams, who was driving towards Florida, disappeared. Witnesses later claimed to have seen 2 women get into Peter's car. The descriptions from these witnesses precisely matched Aileen and Tyria. Later, Eileen's fingerprint was found in Peter's vehicle and on many of his possessions, which had been sold to several pawn shops. Aileen and Tyria murdered 3 other men using the same methods. But in the end, Aileen was arrested by the police due to a fight that broke out in a bar in Florida. At that time, Tyria was no longer living with Aileen, and it seemed they had separated. Interestingly, exactly one day after Eileen's arrest, Tyria was also arrested. Now we get to the section about Aileen's arrest and Tyria's betrayal. It didn't take long for Tyria to confess everything about Aileen and her murders. Within the first few days of her arrest, Tyria was transferred to Florida and stayed in a hotel that the police had rented for her. It's interesting that the police tried very hard to get information from Tyria. You could say they made everything easy for her and promised her freedom and a lighter sentence. In this hotel, at the police's instruction, Tyria called Aileen multiple times and tried to get a confession from her to use against her in court later. In these calls, Tyria spoke as if she was very worried about Aileen and was afraid the police would take everything from her and blame everything on Tyria. Tyria asked Aileen to describe the murders in detail so that if she were arrested, their stories would be the same, but Aileen wasn't that naive and didn't fully give away any of the murders. After 4 days of continuous calls, Aileen finally confessed to a few of the murders, but told Tyria that all the ones committed without Tyria's involvement were in self-defense. During this time, the police had evidence they could use to get her convicted as a serial killer. Aileen remained in jail for all of 1,991 until her trial began. During this period, Tyria fully cooperated with the judicial authorities, and with this cooperation, she was able to gain full immunity from prosecution. Tyria and Aileen usually had phone calls, and Aileen realized that Tyria was betraying her, but it didn't seem to matter much to her. Life in prison was not at all easy for Aileen. Just as she had struggled with many problems outside of prison, prison was not a comfortable place for her either. During her time in prison, Aileen came to believe that her food was being contaminated with spit or urine, and she went on hunger strike multiple times. Many of Aileen's statements in court, and even her conversations with her lawyers, were highly erratic and incomprehensible. For example, at times she would say that the prison staff and her cellmates were plotting against her. Aileen was very agitated and distressed during this time. Like many people in court who feel their case is hopeless, Aileen also decided to fire her defense attorney and asked the court to let her act as her own lawyer. The court quickly agreed to this. But Aileen was not at all prepared for all this work in defending herself against 7 murder charges, and she was completely unable to present any specific defense. We come to the eventful trial and execution of Aileen Wuornos. On the 16th of January 1992, Aileen went to trial for the murder of Richard Mallory, and about 2 weeks later she was sentenced to death. A month later, she announced that she would plead guilty to 3 other murders, and the death penalty was handed down for each of them. In June 1992, Aileen was charged with the murder of Charles Carskaden, and in November of the same year, she was again sentenced to death. If you think that the execution happens quickly, I have to say no. The execution process in Florida was very long and time-consuming. 10 years after Aileen was first sentenced to death, she was still on death row. 10 years, it took 10 years. And during these 10 years, her physical and mental health also deteriorated badly. Psychologists at the trials concluded that Aileen was very mentally ill and had problems with society. In 2001, Aileen formally asked the court to carry out her death sentence sooner because being imprisoned had become too unbearable for her. Aileen claimed that she was being tortured in prison by a special sonic weapon. Aileen's public defender also tried to prove that she was not mentally competent, but Aileen would not cooperate with her lawyer's plan. The situation in prison had truly become so difficult for her that she preferred to die. She even confessed to all the murders once more and wrote in a letter to the Chief Justice, "I am tired of constantly hearing that I'm crazy. I have undergone medical examinations many times. I am completely conscious and sane, and I want to tell the truth. I am someone who strongly despises human life, and if I am released, I will kill again." In 2002, the judicial authorities in Florida carried out the execution of Aileen Wuornos. This woman, who was a prostitute, murdered more than 7 men on the roads of Florida between 1989 and 1990. On the 9th of October 2002, Aileen finally got her wish and was executed at 9:47 p.m. After her death, Aileen's life became the subject of various films, screenplays, and documentaries. One of the most famous works about Aileen is the 2003 film Monster. This film became very famous, and the actress playing Aileen won an Oscar and a Golden Globe for her outstanding performance. The film doesn't focus much on depicting Aileen's murders and crimes, but rather familiarizes us more with Aileen's damaged and suffering character. Aileen Wuornos may never have received the help and support she needed, but her story will always be remembered. A story made of pain, suffering, and wrong decisions. Thank you for being with us. Share your opinions about Aileen's story with us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos. Now I'll ask my question again. In your opinion, was Aileen guilty?